Ave Maria.
At that time, Jesus spoke to the Pharisees this parable. A certain man gave a great supper, and he invited many. And he sent his servant at supper time to tell those invited to come, for everything is now ready. And they all with one accord began to excuse themselves. The first said to him, I have bought a farm, and I must go out and see it. I pray you, hold me excused. And another said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am on my way to try them. I pray you, hold me excused. And another said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. And the servant returned and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house was angry, and said to his servants, Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor, and the crippled, and the blind, and the lame. And the servant said, Sir, your orders have been carried out, and still there is room. Then the master said to the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and make them come in, so that my house may be filled. For I tell you that none of those who were invited shall taste my supper. When our Lord speaks a parable, or indeed when he speaks, we need to be conscious, first of all, to whom he speaks. Secondly, we need to understand, especially in the case of parables, the context in which he speaks. And then thirdly, we need to apply what he has said to ourselves as well. And so when we look at the context to whom he's speaking, we find he's speaking to the Pharisees, and the circumstances in which he is speaking is that of a meal. One of the Pharisees had invited him to a meal, and the Lord had cured the man with dropsy, and then later he spoke about who should be invited to the meal. He's particularly stressing that we should invite those who are not able to repay us, because our Father in heaven, who sees all things, will indeed repay us. And then one of the Pharisees said to him, Happy the person who will be invited to the feast in the kingdom. In other words, put in that invitation into the future, whereas in fact our Lord himself is the kingdom, because he has identified us with his mystical body. He is head and we as members of that body, then the kingdom is with us even now. And so he addresses that issue with a parable of the supper. But what does the parable mean? We need to look at the context, because certainly the manners and the customs and the culture is very different from today's. Usually, a wealthy man having a supper, a dinner, would send out the invitations ahead of time, or we do the same thing. But then he would also send his servant to remind the invitees of the time to come for the supper, because everything is now ready, and so he sends out these servants to tell them come. That would probably be sometime in the afternoon. Again, we're talking about a time when there was no artificial light. It was all daylight. And because there's daylight, people made the best of daylight, of daytime. So that would be the time for them to look at their properties or their servants or their farm and so on. When there's daylight, you can't do it in the dark. So they would think, well, we can go at nighttime when, of course, you don't have to do these business arrangements. And so the the parable runs like this now. A man gave a great supper. St. Matthew has a similar parable, but records it a dinner. A dinner is earlier. A supper is the last meal of the day. And so the Lord is placing this in the context of our final destiny. So we're told he invited many. And we're told it was a great supper. Many were invited. And so he sent his servant at supper time to tell those invited to come. Everything is ready. But they're all with one accord. So there's a single mind, a single purpose in them. They all with one accord began to excuse themselves. So the first says, I have bought a farm and I must go out and see it. Well, you can't look at a farm at night. You can't do it. It has to be whilst it's daylight. Secondly, he says, pray, hold me excuse, in sort of a kind of humility. And then the second one says, I bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I must go and try them out. Well, again, the same thing applies. But then when our Lord speaks, don't forget there's several levels. And the moment we have 5, we should associate it with the senses, the 5 senses. And then the last one says, I've just married, I have a wife, and therefore I cannot come. So he's excusing himself completely. And when the servant returned and reported these things to his master, the master is angry. So let us look now at these 3 excuses that are given. From St. John, we're told that the 3 enemies of our souls, the world, the flesh, and the devil. St. John puts it more graphically, where he says that the things that alienate us from God are the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Now, it's the same thing, the world, the flesh, and the devil. It's the same temptations that our Lord endured in the desert, in the wilderness, where he says, change the stones into bread and throw yourself from the pinnacle of the temple, and all of this I will give you. It's the same kind of temptation. It's always those 3, nothing beyond this. And this is exactly what is happening in this case. So then we look at the first. I have bought a farm. Well, if you have a farm, it is property, and therefore you have to govern it. You have to rule it. You have to control it. You have to look after it. And this is governance. And this is essentially that temptation. The devil on the mountaintop, all of this I will give you. It's all yours if you fall down and worship me. So this is the pride of life, that I am in charge. I am godlike. And this is what the Lord is warning us about in this point. And then the second one, where he says the 5 yoke of oxen. Again, what do the oxen do? They are concerned with material things. They use them for plowing the earth. And we're told a yoke. So we are being tied, because a yoke is for tying the animals together. And so being tied down to things visible, to the things of the senses, is essentially, again, a trap from which it's not easy to escape. And then the last one, I have a wife. Well, this is, so we have in case of the yoke of oxen, the lust of the eyes. So whatever we see, this is in fact we interpret to be reality. And then the last one is essentially the lust of the flesh. So even though marriage is a virtue, a virtuous thing to do, nonetheless, it takes second place to actually go into the true nuptials, which is in fact our union with Christ, our union with God in heaven. And so our Lord is saying that we have to be vigilant for these temptations, no matter how they come. And when we look at the excuses, if we don't understand this, they appear perfectly reasonable. After all, if you're looking after property, you have to do it while it's daylight. You cannot do it at night. But our Lord is saying, no, he says, the wedding feast is now. Nothing should come between your acceptance of the invitation and your going to the wedding. It has to be now. And so he shows his response to those who think they can delay, postpone their salvation for another day, even for tomorrow, or even later tonight. It just doesn't work that way, because time does not belong to us. And so the servant, when he reports these things to his master, we're told the master was angry. And now what does he do? He does two things. The first, he says to the servant, go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city and bring in here the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame. So the first thing is go into the city and bring in all those who were not even thought of. And our Lord would say the same thing again in another way, more graphically, where he says to the Pharisees and the scribes, harlots, prostitutes, and tax collectors are getting into the kingdom before you. You who have all the advantages of the knowledge of the law. You who have the advantages of the dignity of being leaders. You who have been specially chosen by God. You're being left out, and the prostitutes and the tax collectors are getting in. And so that's the first thing that he does. The servant goes out, and speedily he brings all of these in. And then he says, sir, your order has been carried out, and there's still room. So how many people were invited? We were told many. So the master said to the servant, go out into the highways and the hedges, and make them come in, so that my house may be filled. So the second thing, he now sends them outside of the city. So in the first case, we have the invitation being given to the Jews who have rejected it through their leaders. But the Lord nonetheless takes the lower classes, the poor, the crippled, the blind, and even these, there is a mystical interpretation to it as well. He invites those, but there's still room, so he says, go to the Gentiles, those outside of the city, and bring them in. He says, my house will be filled. For I tell you that none of those who are invited shall taste my supper. And so this also is a warning to us, that we have to accept the invitation when God gives it, as he gives it, without hesitation, immediately and straight away. Because to delay is presumption. To delay is in fact to put off our salvation. And we only have the present moment. Tomorrow is not ours, nor indeed is even tonight. So let us ask the Lord to give us the wisdom, prudence, holy prudence, that we will recognize the hour, and that we be ready, and that we be guests at the eternal banquet. In the name of the Father, the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Santa Maria, Mater Dei.